From the closet door that's cracked, to under the bed, to the dimly lit basement, and all the other scary places in between. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Jason Burns.
And I'm Danny Nucci, and this is the What About podcast.
Ooh, I like that voice. That is, I might just keep that on a loop for myself. Let me ask you an actor question, Danny.
Oh no, please don't.
But it ties to what we're talking about with our guest, Jeff Dixon. I'm curious, as somebody who's been in the industry for a great number of years, at what point did horror, from an actor's standpoint, turn and be something that was cool to do? Because I remember, I grew up in the 80s. Not everybody did horror, and it seemed like around like Scream level, like where like bigger names started doing it. Does that sound about right?
Well, I mean, when I grew up, the roles that I was auditioning for were Nightmare on Elm Street.
Really?
And so, two of my very close friends, Rodney Eastman and Ira Hayden, were both cast in Nightmare on Elm Street 3.
Dream Warriors, which is one of my favorites.
Which is one of the best ones, right? So it was just very cool to be in that film and to have it, become what it was. And they still do horror convention. People are crazy about it, man. I mean, it's still extremely cool.
Well, and that's what's cool about horror is even a horror movie that has a small budget and doesn't necessarily get the distribution will still find an audience because people hunt it out.
Well, I just think it's a genre that has thrived and survived and become fashionable and less fashionable, but always present, always present. And when, a film or a television show or even a novel, really catches the attention of the general public, it's just great how everything else sort of starts to follow.
Yeah, I am a horror novel reader. I know we talk about it in this episode. You're not.
I'm not. And I love to read it. I'm not. I can't. It freaks me out.
They're so much scarier than film just because and Jeff Dixon talks about The Shining in there. But for me, the book, The Shining, is, oh my God, there were many instances while reading that book that I just had to put it down and walk away.
Well, without further ado, then let's talk to Jeff Dixon himself, co-creator of the Apple TV show Curses, which is great when we talk about it. Jeff Dixon.
Jeff, you haven't changed in 20 years. You look exactly as you did 20 years ago.
That's good, I guess.
Yeah, that is good.
Well, how could it not be good?
I know. Unless you were an infant 20 years ago, it's good.
Or we were looking into your emotional life. Yeah, you haven't grown at all.
Yeah,
in the last.
No, these are wounds. These are wounds. Yeah, there's no growth in the emotional life. Only regression.
Yes, me too. Okay, so being a Utah boy, when did you and how did it all become this love for horror, sci-fi, fantasy, fangoy?
It's very, very easy. You can pinpoint it to one thing, and I always say this. I grew up in a very, very oppressive religious community in northern Utah.
In Utah?
I know. That is
strange.
That when people are like, how'd you get into horror? I'm like, that's how. Basically, here's what it is. I grew up in an area, and I was raised good Mormon boy, and I started asking questions, which is something that they don't like you to do when you're a kid. So in Sunday school, I'd be like, oh, what's this? And they're like, no, you can't ask questions. You can't ask questions. You just have to have faith that what I'm telling you is true. And I was just like, wait a minute, that I can't ask questions. So I started like percolating in my head.
Now, what kind of questions, Jeff? Like questions about the religion or questions about anything?
It was honestly, I don't even remember exactly what the lesson was, but it was something about, it was like some Bible story or something. And I was like 10 years old, and I like raised my hand, and I'm just like, so, but why? And they're like, no, you can't ask that. And I'm like, wait, what? And I raised my hand again.
Is Lazarus a vampire?
It wasn't even, I wasn't even really into horror at this point. I really was just kind of all, just like curious. But as soon as he said, no, you can't ask questions, you just have faith that what I'm telling you is true, I just started like thinking. So then in my head, I started like conjuring. So then, of course, like kid rebellion, I'm like, oh, I'm going to rebel because they don't like whatever. So how do you rebel? You watch horror movies, you listen to metal music. So it was like, that was what I dove into, was horror and metal. And I just got obsessed from that moment
You
on.
never looked back.
What was the first horror? What was the first metal? Where did you enter? Where did you enter both worlds?
Okay, well, here is my real horror entry level. I always had like a little bit of a curiosity because I had three older sisters, and they kind of would. We were a movie family, like the Oscars were like the biggest day, when I was a kid. I didn't know what the hell it
Wow.
was, but I just knew it was like movies. And so there was always be a stack of VHS tapes in the old VHS player. And there was one weekend.
Unfortunately, I'm quite familiar. Go on.
There was one weekend where my parents were leaving town, and my one of my sisters was supposed to watch me, and the other ones were gone. And she was like, "Oh, I'm going with my boyfriend," and she left. And so it was like the first time I was left home alone. And so I was home alone. I was like 10 years old, around the same time period. And I'm like, okay, well, there's a stack of VHS videos, and one of them was The Shining. And I'm like, I've heard about I'm gonna watch it. So I put The Shining in, and we had this couch. I laid down on the couch. I watched The Shining on our old TV, and it freaked me out so much that by the time it was over, get
Ooh.
off the couch, because I swear, as soon as I put my feet down, something was going to grab me from under the couch. I was like, so I just sat there and watched the TV, and then it ended, and it, automatically rewound, and it turned to like the black and white, like fuzz.
Which is freaky in and of itself. No, kids don't know what that is these days. They don't even know.
No,
What's fuzz?
I know it's watch Poltergeist.
I was gonna say watch Poltergeist. Exactly what I was gonna say.
But I laid there on the couch just staring at it, and it was like we had like a split level house, so it was like downstairs, and you could see like the windows where you could see outside. And I laid on the couch and I stared at the fuzz, and I watched the windows for hours until dawn. So I wouldn't move off the couch till all of a sudden I saw the light start coming up, and then I felt safe to put my foot off the couch because nothing was going to grab me.
But how? Okay, but how did you go? Some people would have that experience and say, "I am never watching a horror movie again."
But this is why. It was at that moment. It was at that moment where I realized it really like kind of freaked me out for a long time, and I was thinking about it, and then I realized, holy crap, something like that can have a lot of power over you. Like, what else can have that kind of hold and that kind of power? So I like got really obsessed with, oh, if you can create this where you can kind of power over somebody. And what's funny is that I've told this story to other people that are way into horror, and so many of them have the exact same similar types of stories. I watched something way too young. It freaked me out way too much. And all of a sudden it became like a dare. It became like can I do it again? Can I do it again? And it was like, it was always, every people that love horror always watch something too aggressive, too young. Plain and simple. It always happens.
They come in too fast. That's what happened to me. So you mentioned, Danny mentioned Poltergeist. For me, it was Poltergeist. My parents, they had no filters. They would just share with me whatever they wanted. So they let me watch Poltergeist. And
That explains it. I didn't know that. Now, fuck, dude, there it is.
Well, it gets even worse. Here comes. I could watch anything, but I had to cover my eyes up for boobies. You couldn't watch boobies, but you could watch murder and mayhem.
Sure.
So I watched Poltergeist, and like you, Jeff, I stayed up all night because I had a fucking tree outside my window that was just like the one from Poltergeist. And probably in a very similar fashion, you go, this is the most awful feeling ever. And then somewhere down the road, you're like, all right, I'll give Nightmare on Elm Street a try at 7 years old.
Well, I love that you cut right in front of the line in terms of, quality horror films. You went right to the source. You went right to the front of the line. One of the greatest, most quality horror films ever made, The Shining. What was the heavy metal? Where did you go? Did you go right to Iron Maiden? Were you like classic? Like, did you go Metallica right away, or did you start with Slayer or Striper?
Yeah. I started more in a gloss rock, to be honest. Like when I was like a kid, I was just like, oh, Def Leppard, man, nobody's harder than that.
So Utah metal, you're Utah heavy metal.
Did you have the Elliott jeans with all the holes in them?
I didn't actually. I still looked.
Oh, man.
I still looked like a decent kid. It was my disguise. Everyone's like, oh, look, it's good little Mormon boy, but it's like behind the scenes.
And when did this start becoming evident? Because obviously at first it was kind of like your own little secret, which is great, right? So you've got your own little world that you're into. When did your sisters and your parents start to go, Jeff, Can we talk about this?
And was it more with the metal or the movies? Which one was more worrisome?
Well, if you asked my dad, it was the metal music. Because I remember coming home one day when I was a teenager, and I found one of my Anthrax CDs broken into a million pieces on my bed.
Oh no!
And he's like, I read those lyrics, and this is devil music, and
Outstanding.
blah 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 blah. And it was like, okay, well, that's one thing. I'm pushing the buttons that I was looking to push. But the horror movie thing, what was funny is I had to keep that really on the down low for a long time, because you're not allowed to watch R-rated movies. And so you like my sisters, the older sisters would, but I like wasn't allowed. So I had to like keep that very secret for a very long time. But I'll tell you, when they started to really like question, like, I gotta say, my parents are amazing, and they've been like super supportive through way too much stuff. Like, I can't believe they've been so as supportive as they have. Like, when I told them I wanted to go to film school, and they're just like, okay, I mean, it's like any other parent would be like, the hell you are. But the one thing I got to say that they started to really think about things was, I started decorating my room beyond just normal like posters. You know what I mean? Like, I had the aforementioned Fangoria posters and the Gore Zones and all that stuff, but I started like doing really weird things. And like, it's gonna sound exactly like it because it's really weird, but like Sid in Toy Story, I would take little parts of toys and I would like create them. So there was one thing, I had a doll head, and I literally stuck all these little pins in this doll head to make my own little pinhead. And then I had this glow in the dark rubber skeleton, and I put the doll head on the skeleton, and I hung it from my ceiling. So anyone who walked in the door would see this dangling pinhead baby face. And I'm sure my parents, first time I saw that, were like, yeah, he's got problems. We got to really look into this.
Yeah, you were on a road, the crossroads of filmmaker and serial killer.
They were thinking exorcism already. They're like, you know what? Time for an exorcism. And you're like, I know what that is. I've seen that film.
So how do your kids rebel against you? Do they watch like Leave It to Beaver or something, and they're like, take that, Dad?
Well, what's funny though is it's a different generation now, where they don't feel like they have to rebel as much because the parents are so different. Like, back then, you grow up in this really like oppressive society, and whenever there's like an oppressive society, the pendulum has to swing the other way, and you have to like rebel so much more to break out of that. But when you've got kind of like these kind of new generation of parents that were rebelling, and they're like, hey man, it's cool as long as you're happy, the kids are like, well, you know what? I'm going to rebel by being straight. I'm going to be square, and that's rebellion. They're like, no, man, come on, have a drink. No,
It's
so
so true. How old are your kids, Jeff? How old are you?
I have a 20-year-old and a junior in college at University of Utah right now, and then I have a senior in high school, 17-year-old here in Palisades. So 17 and 20.
Yeah, but it's interesting. Like, I have a 20-year-old and a 27-year-old. And 20-year-old? No, she's 18. My wife is like, "How your kid's 18? How do you not know that?" But yeah, and the same thing with them. It's like, yeah, no, I don't. I'm good. I'm like, come on, let's listen to this. That's fine. I'm not into it. That's a good. But no, but I mean, you could do it. I don't care. I'm cool that way. They're like, yeah, no, I don't give a fuck.
Yeah, it's funny. As far as the horror goes, too, it's funny, when they were like little kids, they were so into scary stuff. And because I was into scary stuff. So, like, Halloween, holy crap, we would start decorating September 1st, and we would go to Oz or Spirit or one of these places, and we would just walk down the aisles and get stuff. And it was amazing.
Oz, spelled Ahhhhs for those that
Yep,
don't know.
Yep, this is true.
Not Wizard of.
Not Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
Of.
And so and they'd love it, and it was just amazing. Then they got a little older, and they started realizing, oh, this stuff's actually really scary. And then they kind of like went, no horror, no way, no chance. And then they got older, and they're like, oh, actually, Scream is pretty cool. Start dipping their. So they've kind of had this like bouncing. So now they're both kind of getting into it now that they're older. But there was a whole time period where they weren't. I was like, I failed as a parent.
It's so funny, the generational, the generational influences for each one. Like, my younger daughter was really into it. It was the thing, right? And then I'm thinking, for me, it was like Poltergeist and the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, and Mike Myers, Halloween, all that stuff. It's just interesting how like they all have their like particular thing that was their sort of introduction into the world. When did this turn into I need to get out of Utah and do this for a living?
Okay, so growing up where I did, I had proximity to the Sundance Film
You
Festival,
sure did.
which is where the
Yeah,
Park
yeah.
City aspect came in. And the thing that a lot of people don't know that haven't been to Sundance is Sundance has a crazy big horror history. So they have a whole section of midnight movies that basically there's your normal your normal narratives, your normal documentaries, and there's a section of midnight that can be either. So it could be a scary documentary, it could be whatever.
Well, Blair Witch was launched there. I think this was before you.
Well, that's what I was gonna say.
Oh, you were?
My
Okay.
my greatest horror moment of all time was I was in college and I was going through the catalog. You picked your movies based on a paragraph. That was it.
I remember.
And
Wait, hold on. Let me. Can I get another reading on that?
oh,
I remember. Okay, go ahead.
and so this paragraph said Blair Witch Project. And the paragraph basically said, oh, they found this footage of these people disappeared and you're going to watch it. And we're like, oh, that's cool, man. So it wasn't in a narrative section. It wasn't in a documentary. It was in the section that could have been either. So they actually made it seem like it was an actual documentary. So, and none of us had any thoughts of,
Sure, we couldn't Google it and check it out and figure out exactly
yeah,
what read all about it before we saw it. Sure.
yeah, it didn't, there was no reason for you to think that they were trying to pull one out from under you. So we're all going there like, oh, it's going to get, and it was a midnight screening at this janky theater that, well, they've redone it now, but it used to be called the Tower Theater in Salt Lake. It was always kind of run down and crappy. And it was just awesome. It was like heaven for movie people. And so you go there and it was like midnight and I had like 9 of my buddies were like all on this row. And so we're all watching it. And at first we're like, oh, this is really creepy, you know? And then there was a little bit past the middle point where the little stick things and stuff were happening. And I remember looking down and all my friends' faces, like everyone was smiling, everyone had a few drinks before, and then everyone was just kind of like, what are we watching? And then toward the end, I remember looking down and the faces were like white. We're like, we're watching a snuff film, man. This is really legit. And everybody, it like affected everybody. And then the credits rolled and everybody was just dying. And all of us we didn't know what we watched. We're like, this is real. Like this. And then the actors came out on stage for a Q&A and we're like, you bastards. Like it freaked us all out. But I'm like, that no one could ever have that experience again because now everyone's kind of looking for that, but we weren't looking for it.
Yeah, that film would not have worked now in the same way that it did. I completely agree. Yeah.
No, it didn't. And so I will go back a little bit further on Sundance, but I grew up going to a lot of different horror movies at Sundance and thinking to myself, I can make these low budget horror movies. You know, I also grew up loving Sam Raimi and I would read these
Sure.
stories in Fangoria about him putting a camera on some 2x4s and running through the woods with his buddies. And I'm like, I can do that. You know, so I just always had that mentality of wanting to do really low budget kind of horror movies with buddies. And then I went to film school and did low budget horror movies with buddies. And I was like, oh, this sucks.
Did you have the Roger Corman education? You had the Roger Corman education all of a sudden? Well, wait a minute. This can be done.
Yeah, but then again, you're like, oh, but this is a lot of babysitting and it's not as good as it was. So then I started doing screenwriting program and I'm like, oh, you can actually write the stuff and it comes out exactly how you think. You don't have all the logistics of the filming and all that. Mostly, yeah. Well, I've learned a lot more in the years.
Mostly. I mean, don't mean to damper things. I'm just saying mostly. That's all.
But yeah, so then that combined with Utah's a right to work state. It's a non-union state. So a lot of really low budget horror movies come through there. So I was working on a lot of those. And the one that I was working on at the time was The Crow Salvation. It was the third Crow movie. And I was I was a casting assistant on it, but I was also the double for Fred Ward, who was the villain of the movie.
Sure,
the same
Fred
size.
Ward, yeah.
And so we were in there, and then it was like no real like budget for the movie. So me and one other guy ended up being the double for everybody else in the movie. So everybody who gets killed in that movie is me.
You.
So I got impaled by rebar. I got electrocuted. I got squibs put on my back and shot, which is not something you want in a Crow movie.
No, that's not something you want to be doing in a Crow movie.
Yeah. So but I was in the K&B trailer like all the time because I was getting all this makeup put on me. And this is like this gorehound who grew up loving Fangoria. And all of a sudden I'm in this K&B,
bloody
VFX trailer and getting just like prosthetics put on me, and I'm like, this is heaven. And those guys are like, you got to come to LA, man. You got to come to LA.
Yeah, most people are in there going, man, this is taking too long. You're like, more.
It was so true. Like they like I had got electrocuted in one scene, and I had these like little bar. I don't know. The guy had like every time he'd kill somebody, he put like a little metal bar in his arm. And when I get electrocuted up, it bubbled up. And I remember just staring at these bubbles and these things. I was like, this is the coolest moment of my entire life, you know. And but that they like basically were my hype team, where they were just like, gotta come to LA, man. That's where the action's at. You gotta come to LA. So by the end of the shoot, I was just like, I gotta go to LA. So I just packed my truck and literally drove to LA, like without a job, without anything, and just did it.
I love that. You know, because I grew up here, and like I've never I've never done anything else but be an actor. I don't even know how to work. I don't know how to have a job or anything. So when people are like, yeah, you know, I was from there and I'm just moved to LA, and I'm like, how does that? I don't understand. I mean, everybody does it. I understand it, but I just don't get the uncertainty with which you're coming here and going. And everybody's like, well, there's experts, and then there's people that tell you that leave. It's not going to work. It doesn't look. It's not going to be good for you. Just go now. Don't do what I do. Just go now. It's not going to work for you. You know, and you have to supersede those things.
And you don't think about the stuff like, I got to get a primary care physician and a mechanic.
Yeah,
those don't cross your mind.
Yeah, it was one of those things where I really didn't know what I was doing, and I look back now and I'm like, what an idiot, because I didn't have a job. I was crashing on a couch of a friend, and I just got a creative directory back when they were still printed, and I just started cold calling places in the creative directory looking for something. And I lucked into I got 2 interviews, and one of them I can't believe I didn't end up working at. But the first one was Wes Craven Productions, and I was like,
sure,
heaven. And I remember sitting in the couch, and Wes Craven, all like, at the time he seemed like 19 feet tall, walked in, and I was just like, oh my gosh, Wes Craven. And I didn't end up getting that, but then I ended up getting starting off as an internship that then worked into a runner and assistant at Jersey Films, which is Danny DeVito's company. And so that was kind of my trajectory. But I look back at that and I'm like, holy crap! Because also 2 weeks after I moved here, because we were in Koreatown when I first moved here, was when the Lakers won their first of their next batch of championships, and so it was like that those riots that happened at the time.
Yeah,
and so they were like right outside our door, and I had lived here for like 2 weeks, and I was like, I'm gonna die, and I just moved here, and one of the girls I was here got her Jeep stolen. And like they found it stripped in a Jack in the Box parking lot, and I'm like, "What did I do? I made a horrible mistake."
Cut to a life in horror, writing horror, and to this wonderful television show, Curses, which, by the way, could have the best opening of any animated show ever. I'm crazy about it. It's like, okay, what am I? It really sets you up for exactly what you're going to get. It's great musically, visually. It's terrific. Can you talk a little bit about the genesis of that and how that happened?
Oh yeah. Well, I'm so glad you said that about the opening, because that is our absolute.
It's fantastic.
That is our absolute genius director, Leo Riley. Came up with that. He is just an absolute visual genius. And when he came to us and he's had this idea. And we had all of us had a lot of kind of outlandish ideas for what was considered kind of gateway horror animation for kids. And we were talking about this new intro, and he goes, have you seen the intro or the beginning of the movie Lord of War? And so I was like, yeah, you know, where you follow the bullet. And he's like, yeah. And it's this really disturbing moment where you're following a bullet in its creation through all of its different, you know, it's being made, it's been everything. And then it ends in this devastating moment where you find out where the bullet ends up. But he was like, let's do that. He's like, let's follow this, you know, this basic artifact that ends up being, you know, kind of the whole season trajectory, and let's just follow it from its capture to its curse. And he's like, and so the whole beginning was all based around the intro to Lord of War, which is not what normal people would think about for kids animation.
Well, and what's interesting doing animation, I'm assuming this is your first animation series.
I have a little bit of experience in comics and graphic novels, so I have a little bit of experience in, you know, visual storytelling, that direction. But for the most part, I was very much a novice. I was very much live action guy, and my writing partner on this project, Jim Cooper, he kind of comes from the world of family entertainment, comedy, animation, and so we've always been friends for a while because our kids went to the same school. And this was like we're like, oh, we both had our own careers, and we're just like, let's take your world and my world and see what we can do. And so that was kind of where this came from. Was it was a combination of my horror world and his kind of family and animation world.
And did you guys pitch it together?
We did. We initially conceived it as live action, and we had some motion and live action, but then we were at a studio and they're like, you guys know this is like completely cost prohibitive, right? Like, you travel the world. And we're like, oh yeah, you're right. And so it was after that Cooper, my writing partner, was like, I just did this project with Cartoon Network, and they were kind of just chatting about how they're maybe thinking about doing something scary. And so we're like, holy crap, why don't we switch this to animation? And so then we started to reconceive it in the world of animation. And we're like, oh, it doesn't matter where you are. You could go to Africa.
Opened up everything, right? Yeah.
And then, we since learned the limitations of that later as well. But yeah, so it kind of spawned that way. And when I started, I knew very little about the world of animation. I now feel like I could do a 2-hour TED talk on animation, because it's like we also started it as a 2D project, so we had to learn the 2D pipeline, and then along the way we ended up switching it to more of a CG. And where we land, we like to call it 2.5D, because it's like it has the look of like a graphic visual. Our basis of it was the old EC comics, like Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror, that kind of inspiration, and using that in a CG. So now I had to learn the CG pipeline. And so, man, now I feel like I know all there is about animation.
I feel like it fills a hole. Like, me and my kids love Gravity Falls, and it hasn't been on for years, and it fills the Gravity Falls hole.
100%. I talk about Gravity Falls all the time. I love Gravity Falls.
We have always had similar sensibilities, Jeff, and we watched the same things growing up. How much of this is like 10-year-old wish fulfillment for Jeff?
So much. It's so much. It's what's really fun about it was a constant push or pull to see where we landed as far as the balance of scares and all that. Like, obviously my tendency was to push as many scares as possible. And I got a lot of pushback most of the time. But what's really great about where we landed was, I would push my tendency, and then my writing partner would be like, dude, what are you talking about? You're going to terrify these kids. And so we'd pull back a little bit. And then he kind of has more of a animation and zany mentality. And my one rule was no zany. So it was like, anytime something was
Ruh-roh.
yeah, exactly. So anytime there was something zany, we'd pull that back. And that's where we kind of landed in the middle of our two sensibilities. We kind of pushed and pulled each other.
That's good. You guys had margins that either one of you couldn't cross out of.
It's exactly it.
I have a question for you. What was it like for you to be casting the show and somebody said, would you like to have Freddy Krueger play a role in this?
It was funny because we work really well with the casting department, and some of the people we say we really would like A, B, or C, and they're like, okay, let's try. And then they would give us lists. So we always said, if we could get some people from the world of horror, that would be really wonderful. And we never were really specific, because you don't want to be too heartbroken if you're like, go for A, and they're like, no, they said no. So when Robert was on the list for Cornelius, I was like, oh, this isn't even a question. Are you kidding me? And I actually, believe it or not, had to do a little bit of battling internally. There were people that wanted, that maybe didn't think that he had the pool or whatever. And I'm like, are you high? So I fought like crazy. And
isn't that sad that you have to fight for Robert Englund to be in a horror themed show? I mean, it's crazy.
Well, it is crazy because they always say, like, never meet your heroes, but I'm telling you, meet him if they're Robert Englund, because he's the most incredible guy in the world. I was so happy when we finally worked with him, because you are a little nervous. You're like, oh man, don't be an a-hole, whatever. And he was the opposite. He was so nice. And he's like an actual horror fan.
And he's so articulate, and the way he tells a story is like
And
crazy.
he's an actual horror fan. Like he'll just sit you down and talk to you for 20 minutes about some arbitrary horror movie that you haven't even heard about. You're like, this is amazing.
What about the psychology of horror? So when you're writing, are you thinking about it more that way, or is it just you expressing ideas that freak you out?
Well, it's funny because working out here, most of the time, a lot of my friends who are writers, a lot of them, or majority of them, are comedy writers. And a lot of them are in writing teams. And I realized, and I was never in a writing team until this project with Coop. And I realized as they were in teams, the main reason is they would bounce jokes off each other. Does this work? Does this work? Does this work? And there's a lot of that. But with horror, so much of horror is psychological and so like personal that it's hard to work in a team setting because it's hard to get to that weird kind of psychological place together because what one person really is freaked out by, the other person's like, whatever, dude, and vice versa. So what's funny is when we were writing episodes together, Coop and I, whenever there were scary moments, he'd be like, yeah, just do that scene. So I would just go off and so all this suspense and scary scenes weren't even collaborative because it almost is sometimes hard to write those collaboratively because they're so personal. So yeah, I always delve into kind of my own, what I feel scary or what I'm freaked out by. And I am, by the way, I am super freaked out by stuff. Like people always be like, oh, you're Mr. Horror Guy. You're like just laying back going, ooh, open the door. No, forget it. Like I am the one watching through my fingers, looking down. I'm so susceptible, but that's why I love it.
I feel like I remember you telling me a story once about you going to the R-rated haunted house in Vegas. So when you go through a haunted house, are you like jittery guy?
I both. It's funny. I worked in a haunted house too. And it's funny because the people who are like hiding in the back think they're getting away. When you're working there, you're like, well, obviously that's the one we're going after. You're hiding in the back is not telling anybody. There's little holes in the wall so you can see people coming. You're like, okay, well, that's who we're getting. So you don't do that anyway, if you don't want to be scared.
I just took my family to Hershey Park and they do 5 haunted houses. And they have this new effect that I haven't seen before where you go into this one room and it's supposed to seem like the room is flooding. And they have lasers from the top and lasers from the bottom. And it makes it look like water's rising and it's coming up over your head. And it's fucking terrifying. It's like my daughter, who is only like 2 feet tall, I had to pick her up because she thought she was drowning.
That is so incredible. I love the new technology that's coming out in haunted. I love haunted houses and haunts. And in fact, one of my other kind of dream careers is to work in haunts, work at Not Scary Farm or develop these mazes because I love that.
My buddy just literally had a first date. He's our age, and he had a first date, and he's like my buddy Justin, and he took this girl to a haunted walk. He lives in Georgia. It was a haunted walk, and it was like the perfect date. They were both completely freaked out and were able to sort of, commiserate and just have the, exhilaration afterwards, because that's part of the psychology, is the relief that it's over. The relief that it's done and where it lands you. You both have this, shared experience. But I thought that was a genius idea that he had, because it really connected them at the end of
That's
it.
one of the things that is so great. Think about, and it's this kind of cliche, but think about a roller coaster. It's like when you're done with the roller coaster and the roller coaster's done, what does everyone do? They're just like, yeah, they cheer and they clap because it's like, we did it. It's that same sort of elation. Like I always talk about how it's like a sneeze, where it's like the sneeze might be a lot, but then a second after the sneeze, you're like, oh, that feels so awesome. Or some people who don't like horror would probably say it's like throwing up.
That sounds like an orgasm, Jeff.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that because you're like, okay, well, that's done. That's over. No, it's the elation if it comes afterwards.
I'm going to go watch a horror movie now.
Or make a sandwich.
Well, I will say it's almost like, and this is maybe the more gross version, but it's like throwing up. Like you feel so, it's like it sucks to throw up.
Yeah,
but when you're
yeah.
throwing up, do you ever feel better in your life?
Oh, man, what a relief.
Well, what about this, Jeff? So go ahead.
No, you have a what about this? I don't have a what about this. You go with the what about this.
So, I'm a dog guy. I have 3 dogs. They hate being scared, right? The trash truck, whatever it is, they hate it.
Vacuum.
But why do we humans, it seems unique to us, why do we like being scared? What's the psychology behind it?
Thing you got to remember is a lot of people don't like being scared. I mean, you always just have to realize that everybody's wired a little differently. So when people like say, "Oh, I just don't like being scared because it sticks with me," I can't argue with that. I'm like, okay, well, you just have a different. You're just wired a little differently. I get it.
That's you. You don't like the scary stuff.
I tell you, man, it just sits. Those images sit with me, and I sometimes have to do work to go. It's just a movie. It's just a movie. You've done movies. You know where you saw where the camera was. You saw where the lighting was coming from. The lighting was coming from that window.
What about books? You're a big reader. To me, the books can be scarier than the movies.
The books are scarier, but so I don't really read horror. I don't
Okay.
because it will just sit in my head, and it's not a movie. I want to sleep is the point. I'd like to sleep. That's what I'd like to do.
But so here's the thing. So I understand that everybody's wired a little differently in that way, and some people just are not into it. But for those of us who do really like it, where a lot of that, it falls into a couple different categories. I mean, the first one, honestly, and I always talk about this in pandemic terms, because they were saying that like during the pandemic, horror movies actually, like horror movie watching went way up. And not just the pandemic, but after 9/11, like anytime there's like big events,
Literally, the movie Pandemic was like the most watched movie for like a month on one of the
like
streamers.
Contagion and Outbreak and all of those. Yeah.
Is it control? Is it for a sense of control?
It's a little bit of that. So a lot of what it is people are like, the world is so horrifying. I can't understand it. I can't get a grasp on it. I don't know how to handle this. So you direct that kind of anxiety and horror into something you can control. It's like, these are zombies or whatever. Oh, and it's over and it's done. Okay. So there gives you a little bit of a completion, where like the horrors of real life don't ever have a completion. They continue and you don't know how to handle them. But if you can direct that into something like a horror movie, you can direct it into something. It takes your focus away. It's like, it detaches you from like the real horrors of the world, but then it also gives you a little bit of completion, or a little bit of, they always say that a lot of women love true crime and true crime podcasts, and it's a very, very female focus. From my wife is obsessed with Dateline NBC. That's like all she watches.
My older daughter loves it.
And they say that one of the main psychological reasons for that is women are going, okay, you know what? This is like a manual. I can spot the serial killer. I can keep myself out of danger. I can see this.
Yeah, because 99% of the times it's the husband.
Or they're in Utah. But yeah, it's like, so a lot of people use other types of horror as that type of manual. It's like, or back to haunts, it's like people going through haunted houses. Sometimes people want to go like, if a real horror came my way, how would I react? I don't know how I'd react. And then all of a sudden it's like, would I scream and run the other way? I wasn't expecting that. Or would I like fight or flight? Like, some people are trying to test to see how they would react to real horrors using false horrors. So there's a lot of that kind of detachment from the reality and using the fake.
So Jeff, one of the things we love to do is we like to have a listener question. So I want to posit this to you. Jennifer K asks, what is the most you have ever been actually scared, and why did it feel different than the other scares you have spent your life seeking out?
Wow, that's okay.
I like it. She's got multi-part questions. It's great.
Well, the funny thing is this is gonna sound a little bit like a horror movie, but it's where I grew up. So one of the things that we would do a lot is just, I mean, when you're teens or high school and you grow up in a small town, you just look for things to keep you busy. You know what I mean? Because there's just not a lot to do. And so one of the things we would do is we would go and explore like abandoned buildings, or, there's a lot of like old pioneer ruins or hikes you can go to, that are all over the place. And there would always be stories about them. Oh, the ghost here, or the whatever. And they're just, and
Very
so
Scooby-Doo.
it is. But that shit happens in like small towns, because it's like, what else do you do?
For me, it was a street where you had to drive. It was a dark street. You shut off the headlights, and then if you look in the mirror, you'll see the boy who died there 30 years before.
There's a lot of that kind of stuff, And so I did have a few of those moments. I'll say two that were truly, truly like terrifying. And I'm not a skeptic, but I'm not a believer. I mean, I'm a little bit of both. It's like, yeah, I can't believe everything, but you can't deny everything either. So it's like, there's two things. Number one area in particular, and I hope I can find it again because it was so long ago, but it's in like the mountains way past, like there's this area called Kazi Dam in Utah, whatever. You go way out there, and there was a hike, and supposedly there was like an old cemetery, like a pioneer cemetery where there were some graves, but where the water had come up, the water would start to like kind of sunk down a little bit, and so some of the graves or whatever underneath, like
Rising
were
up.
where the ground was receding, was like starting to point up, so you couldn't see, they weren't like coming out of the water, but you could see like the grass or the ground would have like an angle of like,
Well, and these were probably old pine boxes too, right?
exactly. And so it, like that, walking to that at night had the most terrifying, like truly like this is really something's here type of vibe. So that was one moment where I'm like, there's something feeling here. Another one, and this one is very strange, but I'll never forget it. In Salt Lake City, there was a couple buildings that were under construction, and one of them I think was under construction, and it stopped construction or something. It was just like still had the scaffolding and all that stuff. So of course, being idiot high schoolers, we went to this and, well, let's go explore. We're urban explorers. Look at us. And so we're wandering around this building. It's dark, and it's just exactly what you'd think: abandoned building, half built construction, and the elevator, nothing. It was like no electricity or whatever. And then we're like, okay. And then we went and it started moving again. And we were like, okay, someone's screwing with us. We walked everywhere. There was no people, no nothing. And then it was just like the weirdest. I cannot explain it. So I guess my psychology of this is, instead of running away from that kind of stuff, I actually wrote aspects of both of those into two different projects. So I like the cemetery one. I actually wrote a project called Cemetery City, which was based kind of around that experience. And then another one I also wrote into another project with the elevator.
I hope that's called Hellevator.
There's actually a movie called that, by the way.
Oh, hell.
Oh man, I love that dude. How long have you guys been friends? And why am I yelling?
We'll yell the whole time. It's a very busy room we're talking in. Oh, there's trucks outside.
I was just energized. I loved it. I love talking to him. I just love somebody that's that, passionate about something.
Well, and that's how we met. We had the same agent. We were both with William Morris Agency back in the day. And I think they just said these two guys would get along great. And sure enough, we started talking about horror, and the rest is history.
Did they try to pair you together on projects?
I don't think it was on projects. It was just like, I don't live in Los Angeles. They would always try to pair me up with some clients when I was in town to have some dinners and just do some things.
and they weren't willing to wait 6 days for you to drive here.
Yeah,
from Massachusetts.
No, yes, exactly.
We can set a meeting 6 days from now, but you should probably have a few meetings put together just in case, so I don't have to drive back.
I think the same day that I met Jeff, I also met Carter Oosterhouse, who was he is the host of Great Christmas Light Fight. So I love Christmas. I love Halloween. The agent at the time really knew who I was.
I was going to say, talk about, understanding their client.
I know.
Well, this was terrific. And I just want to thank you all for listening.
Music by Denny Nucci. Produced and edited by the same two people you heard hosting this show, because they have no friends.